This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church. This week, we are going to be looking at the ethnic identity argument in Galatians. Galatians, being a letter of Paul, is a moment where we're going to be talking about what does Paul have to say about the question of Jews and Gentiles. Well, actually, in Galatians, this is a very complicated conversation, but it really stems, or maybe better, can be encapsulated in two central verses. Galatians chapters 3, 28 to 29. And in this, the first half of that, Galatians 3:28, might be the most commonly quoted passage in the whole of Galatians, in some circles, the whole of Paul, where Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. This has often been saying, so what is this question about ethnic identity and this question about Jews and Gentiles? Well, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, but one in Christ Jesus. So there you go. It's been solved. But then you have the very next verse. And in that very next verse, Paul says, well, if you are in Christ, then you are in fact a seed of Abraham and an heir of Abraham's promise. Now we have more of a challenge. How do these two things fit together? I thought that you said there was no Jew nor Gentile. No problem. We're done with this thing now about Jews and Gentiles. It's just you're one in Christ. And then you say, well, if you're in Christ, then in fact you may not have been aware of it, but you are in fact an heir of Abraham and thereby an inheritor of the promise. So it seems like there's some sort of odd tension going on. Paul's making two statements at once and holding them into tension. On the one hand, all those Gentiles who are not the part of Israel, no problem, you're one in Christ. And yet, you Gentiles who apparently had no problem, you could just be in Christ, also are actually heirs of Abraham, granted in another way. He'll use language of adoption rather than natural birth. But this is kind of strange. So what we will be discussing and what we will be thinking about today for our video is what's Paul up to? There's the technical arguments for how Paul gets there, but far more foundational to our own meaning is, why does it matter? What's the purpose? Well, we'll find Paul is speaking in a very contemporary way in things we would call identity. He doesn't use the word identity. That's not really an ancient category, but it fits very well what Paul's talking about. It's a fundamental question of who are we before God? And that, I think, question we're asking constantly today. And what Paul is looking for is to know who we are and to be able to say we have a stable identity, something we can count on. It's not just that, well, today I feel like I'm in a really good relationship with God, and then tomorrow, who knows? Or worse, that today God feels like I should be in a good relationship, and tomorrow, who knows? But instead, that it's stable. Who we are can be something that we can count on and know. And so this is why many scholars have turned to saying, what is going on with this ethnic argument? And I want to say really quickly about ethnicity in antiquity. Ethnicity had nothing to do with skin color. And that's not just a Christian thing. That is simply in antiquity, that was not something that was tied together. Race and skin color were not connected. That becomes connected in the medieval world well after all of this. So we call it Paul's ethnic argument, and of course he's talking about Jews and Gentiles. And he challenges a few of our modern day assumptions. The idea we have is that ethnicity is something that one is kind of born with. You can't just decide to be a new race, a new ethnic identity. Some people in the news have failed to learn that lesson. Instead, this is something that is developed through kinship, that you gain this from your ancestors. And we see that as very different than religion, where religion is something one can simply change and can simply choose something else. If one wants to convert, they convert. Well, in antiquity, including for Paul, these two things were not as different as we often would suggest. They saw more flexibility in ethnicity, in that one did have more ability to shift their ethnic identification, and they saw less flexibility in their religion. That it wasn't so simple simply to choose another religion and start doing that. That is a modern day discourse. Probably the best space that most Americans can recognize in a contemporary structure would be Judaism of the 21st century, where it's both an ethnicity and a religion, and these designations go backward and forward. All I want to do in pointing this out is to complicate this a little bit for us, and to suggest that there is, especially in Paul's writings, more tie-in between those two things. Who we are and how we worship are really related. And we're probably pretty comfortable saying that about other aspects of our identity, but ethnic identity, we might be a little more skeptical. But remembering that Paul is talking primarily about Israel, and specifically not just Israel vaguely, but promises given to Israel in the Hebrew Bible. And in the Hebrew Bible, there is that Israel are the people of God. And so Paul is dealing with this question of, well, these promises were given to Israel, but then what about the Gentiles? And in fact, can they be the recipients of those promises given to Israel? And Paul wants to say affirmatively, absolutely. But how's that going to work? He is going to lead through a complicated argument that one's relationship with Christ has changed the nature of religiosity and in some ways ethnicity. That one can, in fact, be a descendant of Abraham in new ways. And Paul will actually make 4 different arguments for the ways in which he makes his case. Saying they were there this whole time, they didn't know. Saying they'd been adopted in. Saying that there was an allegorical way in which there was a room in this new covenant for new promises and new heirs. But the biggest issue is saying that in Christ, that because of the invasion of the Christ in the present, there has been new flexibility in what it means to be the people of God. But what Paul does not do is he never says, and therefore those promises to Israel were temporary and they're in the past. No, he still holds those up. Those are important because they say all of it needs to lead to what does it mean to be children of God. And in order to be children of God, one does become heirs of the promise, the seed of Abraham, and indeed one all together with all others. But we end up with a fundamental question of, again, what's the purpose of this whole thing? It's not just an academic exercise, but so that you, Gentile Christians who he's talking to in Galatians, can know that you are children of God. You can have stability into not just what religion you believe in, but your very identity about who we are. There will be more conversation about this in our adult education hours coming up, but this is just a few minutes for you to be thinking about what is Paul and Galatians doing and how does it matter for 21st century Christianity. This is Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.